Hello, and welcome to the section Patching a Bash Vulnerability. Here we will understand the Bash vulnerability through Shellshock, look into Shellshock's security issues, and apply patches on the Linux systems. So, let's move to the first video that deals with understanding the Bash vulnerability through Shellshock. Shellshock, or bash door, is a vulnerability that's used in most versions of Linux and Unix operating systems. It was discovered on September 12, 2014, and it affects all the distributions of Linux using a bash shell. The Shellshock vulnerability makes it possible to execute commands remotely using environment variables. To understand Shellshock, we need a Linux system that uses a version of bash prior to 4.3, which is vulnerable to this bug. Here we will take a look at how to set up our system to understand the internal details of the Shellshock vulnerability. The first step is to check the version of bash on the Linux system so that we can figure out whether our system is vulnerable to Shellshock. To check the version of bash, we run the command bash-version. Now, bash versions from 4.3 and onwards have been reported to be vulnerable to Shellshock. For our example, we are using the Ubuntu 12.04 LTS desktop version. From this output, we can see that this system is vulnerable. Now let's check whether the vulnerability actually exists or not. To do so, we run the code env x equals single inverter comma parenthesis echo shellshock bash-c in double quotes echo testing. Once we run this command, if the output has Shellshock printed, the vulnerability is confirmed. Let's understand the insights of the vulnerability. For this, we first need to understand the basics of the variables of the bash shell. If we want to create a variable named test_var in bash and store a Shellshock value in it, we execute the command test_var equals double quotes Shellshock and end this statement with single quotes. Now if we wish to print the value of this variable, we use the echo command. We shall open a child process of bash by running the bash command. Then we again try to print the value of the test_var variable in the child process. So let's write bash. Again, run the bash command and in the next line type echo space $symbol test_var. We can see that we don't get any output when we try to print the value in the child process. Now we shall try to repeat this process using the environment variables of bash. When we start a new shell session of bash, a few variables are available for use, and these are called environment variables. To make our test_var variable an environment variable, we will export it. Once it's exported, we can use it in the child shell as well. For this, let's type export test_var equals shellshock echo test_var bash echo test_var. As we have defined variables and then exported them in the same way, we can define a function and export it in order to make it available in the child shell. The next steps show you how you can define a function and export it. X parenthesis open braces echo in single quotes shellshock semicolon and braces closed. And now call x. Continue writing the next line, export-fx bash x. In this example, the x function has been defined, and it has been exported using the -f flag. Now we have defined a new variable, named it testfunc, and assign it a value. Let's go ahead and run this. Now this variable can be accessed in the same way as a regular variable with the command echo $testfunc. This is what makes bash vulnerable to Shellshock, where specially crafted variables can be used to run any command in bash when it is launched.